Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Foresight TV. I am with somebody that I've known in the industry for, I don't know, a long time. Probably more than a decade, I'm thinking. Ken, I first met at a conference in Florida, and we just found that we had very similar interests and passion for leadership in the world of senior living. And Ken is really an expert, has been an expert a long time. So we're going to just have a terrific conversation. But before we get started, this. Hey guys, Steve Moran here. So before we get started, I got to tell you that this show is brought to you by KARE with a K. They are the anti-staffing agency, staffing agency. So if you are using temporary staff and you are paying those outrageous prices for staff to fill in those holes in your schedule, you should stop doing that and use KARE instead. They are the Uber, if you will, of staffing. They will help you find great team members at a fraction of the cost of your traditional staffing agencies. They are great people. They are not only sponsors, but they are friends, and I love what they do. They are passionate about making senior living better. They're passionate about making your business better. So if you have any staffing challenges at all, you should reach out to them. You can see the link right there. Ken, welcome.
Thanks. Excited to be here.
Me too. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. You are somebody who is very prolific on LinkedIn, and you talk about really important leadership topics. Let's actually start with a little bit of your background and your passion for senior living, what you have been doing and what you're doing today.
So the nutshell is I was in commercial real estate development, believe it or not, when I got a call from a recruiter that said, "Hey, I understand that you have some expertise in doing turnarounds. Would you come to work for a contractor that does contracting in senior living and turn that company around?" And that was my introduction to senior living. It was a food services contracting company. And eventually they were acquired by Sodexo, and I ran the West Coast of Sodexo for a number of years. And that just evolved. Then I went into operations with a company that was called American Baptist Homes of the West, originally joining them to turn around their dining program. And Dave Ferguson was the CEO at the time, and he came in my office one day and he said, "Why are you doing food services?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he offered me the opportunity to be the co-COO of the company with Bella Mahoney. And it evolved from there. But I've spent the bulk of my career, which is almost 40 years now, in senior living, doing mostly rebuilding, turning around, stabilizing senior living and post-acute care companies.
So as we were talking, and we talked offline, we look at the senior living industry, and I think this is true. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we see so much opportunity. We see so much good that's being done. And yet at the same time, we see, I don't know what the right word is, challenges or maybe opportunities to really make a difference in the leadership area. And so what are the areas where you think there's great opportunity? Where are the areas do you see us really struggling? And I'm going to start by setting the stage a little bit more. I've been to conferences the last 2 weeks. I've got another one next week. And one of the things that's different than any time since I've been going to conferences, I think, is that it's pretty terrible in the industry. We go to conferences, and from the front, people are sort of talking about the good things they're doing and how good they are. But when I sit and I talk to operators, what I mostly hear is we are really struggling. We're struggling with occupancy. We're struggling with staffing. And even those people who kind of have it together with the staffing and the occupancy, they're just struggling because it's really expensive. Expenses have gone up so much. So where do we go with all that?
Wow. We've got what, 20 minutes left? I write a lot about this and about that specific subject because I don't think from a mathematical point of view the solution is difficult at all. It's sixth grade math. And the reality is there needs to be, we keep trying to incrementalize change in this industry. And when I say this industry, I'm speaking specifically of skilled nursing in particular, because when I say incremental, you've got the new staffing regulations that are coming out that are more national in scope. Well, very similar uh, staffing ratios or staffing requirements were mandated in California a couple decades ago. And so if the large system operators have been running with staffing ratios like that for literally a couple of decades. And so all of the acrimony around it surprises me. But the reason it doesn't surprise me is that it doesn't really fix anything. The common belief is if you throw more bodies at it, care will be better, is just wrong. And it's wrong because we don't understand the verticals in the industry. Skilled nursing is not skilled nursing. You've got high acuity skilled nursing, you've got custodial nursing, often in the same building, right? Those are entirely different products that you would staff differently. And there's a product that doesn't exist uniformly, which is a strictly high acuity assisted living product, which is really what, just for a round number, 40 or 50% of the people that are sitting in skilled nursing today really belong in, is in a high acuity assisted living. They don't really require nursing care. They require help on ADLs, med management, grooming, transportation, those kinds of things. But because of the way the regulations are set up, the only place they'll get funded is in nursing homes. So there's an entire vertical that's missing. And if you segregated that out, a lot of the acrimony around staffing issues would probably go away. And here's why. If I'm running a high acuity building with, say, a 50 or 60% Medicare or high acuity mix in terms of my patients, and the staffing ratio, just for a round number, let's say the nurse staffing ratio is 3.5 hours per day per patient. If I've got a building that's 50% or more skilled, I'm already running above that. If I've got a TBI building, I'm probably running, or a vent building, I'm probably running 5 or 7 hours a day. But if I'm running a strictly custodial building, and the vast majority of the buildings that I'm aware of out there are at least 50, 60, 70, 80% custodial. And custodial, just so we're all clear, is somebody that's living there that really doesn't have a demonstrative need for nursing because they're not improving, they're static in their situation. They're mostly getting ADL care, activities of daily living. If that's my building and I'm required to run at a 3.4, 3.6, 4.0, whatever that number is, that's a loser. And that represents the vast majority of what I see out there. Everybody works for a higher acuity level, but it's then that leads into the second problem, and then I'll shut up. The second problem is nationally, we're about 70 skilled nursing, or nursing is about 70% occupied, but more than 25% of the states are less than 70%. Some as low are in the low 50s. And there isn't a business model out there that will show you that that's going to make money. Well, if you've got 50% excess capacity, what would any other industry do? They'd consolidate. But because the way the Medicare reimbursement system works, we're still building. Texas has 53%, I think, average occupancy in nursing. They're still building brand new buildings. They're not replacing, they're adding beds. That doesn't make any sense at all.
So I think that the challenge that, I mean, so you sort of thrown it back to me with another 2 hours worth of discussion, right? I think that we have this system that was built, regulatory and financial system that was built 50 years ago, 40 years ago, right? And it just doesn't work very well today. And yet I see some high level discussion saying it's not working, we need to fix it. but I don't know that I see any serious movement to do that. And well, let's just take as a for instance the idea that what we need is a higher acuity assisted living, and it really does exist in the private pay world today. There are a lot of people who, if they had no money, would be in skilled nursing, but because they have financial resources, they can get the care that they need in assisted living. And so I agree with you on that, but there's this great conundrum is that if we take those people out of skilled nursing, put them into assisted living, we're going to invite more regulation. And it seems pretty clear to me, and you might dispute this, but it seems pretty clear to me that on the skilled nursing side, every time there's a problem, we add more regulations. But I think it would be hard to argue that it actually has made the quality of care better. So how do we find a path forward?
So one of the things that we did 20 years ago in Fremont, California, was we took an independent living building, completely unlicensed, other than a business license. Independent living doesn't have a regulatory environment, right? And we literally created a virtual CCRC overnight by doing two things. We set up a separate ADL company that's going to deliver care services for grooming and feeding and transportation and all of those things. And then we contracted with a home health care agency to come in. And the home health care agency was the regulated entity, right? And in doing that, it was frankly an insanely profitable model. And the patient got much more individualized, focused care. And they were in a better environment than sitting in a skilled nursing building.
So what did you do about the reality that somebody's got to be able to, I don't know, answer a call bell if there's a problem all the time? Because typically the home health agency is not going to be there 24/7.
Well, but in that specific situation, we actually set up nurses stations. They had offices on site. And one of the quid pro quos was, we're going to give you access to 400 or 300 or 200 residents. And you don't have to move anywhere. There's no transportation costs. There's no lost productivity. You've got 200 or 300 or 400 people right here. And so they had staff on duty 24/7. And they actually set up a clinic and had an NP come in to do services over and above. We provided free office space, but they created a clinical environment. Again, this was 20 years ago, but they created a clinic environment where there was 24/7 care and they could get primary care on site.
So does that community still exist?
The community still exists, but when it was sold, because remember, a lot of what I did growing up as an operator was reposition companies to be sold. And so when it was sold, I believe that model died. It still exists in places, and CCRCs continue to do it, not just the buy-in, but there are rental communities as well. So the model still exists. It's not a predominant model.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's not the way we do it. Inertia. There's an enormous amount of people that want to do creative things, but if there's anything I learned, and I'm going to switch the conversation just by way of example. When we sold Shea Family to a company in San Diego, which was a company you and I knew, and I was running it, the family was intensely focused on getting a buyer that was focused on maintaining their culture, their belief systems, all of those things. And so they could have got a much higher sales price, but they picked somebody that promised to maintain what they had. And I knew, because I'd been through that pony ride before, the sheer force of will, of inertia, not having to do with any one individual, the culture of the predominant player overwhelmed the new entity. And it wasn't because somebody didn't want to change. It was the sheer force of will of inertia. And so why don't we change? Because that's just not how we do business. That's why it's going to require a fundamental sweeping change at a regulatory level.
So one of the things that's really interesting as you were describing this building in Fremont is that when I think back to my early days of writing and blogging, one of the complaints I used to hear a lot from assisted living operators was that there were people who were running independent living communities and then bringing in home health, and that they were really running a de facto assisted living without having to be licensed, which meant they sort of had an easier go of it. And I don't really know why. If somebody's watching and has some thoughts on this, I actually never hear anybody complaining about that anymore. Do you have any thoughts on why we don't hear that complaint anymore? Because I know it still happens.
Well, in the old days, and again, and I don't know what old days are, but I'm not currently an operator, if you will. But skilled nursing used to say the same thing about assisted living. They were taking patients away from skilled nursing by providing higher level of care on an unregulated basis. Because you don't have, if you're in California and you're in assisted living, you could be bringing in patients that have the resources to do private pay at a third or two-thirds the rate of skilled nursing, right? And have a nicer environment, and you don't have the staff of 3.6 or whatever the requirement is in California, which makes the an enormous competitive advantage. And so skilled nursing use, it's the answer is it's absolutely a complaint, but the solution isn't necessarily to make everybody the same. The answer should be, let's really do a good job of defining all the verticals of care in a continuum and create staffing requirements that are resident, acuity, and resource aware specific.
Okay, so I'm going to throw a hypothetical at you. I want I want to have I want to be king of the world, or at least king of the United States, and completely revamp the skilled nursing environs, both on a regulatory and a financial basis. But I can't seem to get anybody who will let me do that. So if you have some ideas about how that would happen, I'd really love that. But I don't have any idea to do that. So given that that the system's not likely to change, I come to you and I'm operating 25 skilled nursing buildings and they're not doing very well. And I come and can say, how do I make this both make money and create a better resident and employee experience within the context of what I have? Where are some opportunities?
Okay, so let's define that a little more, because if they're not doing well, they're probably primarily custodial. They probably don't have a high skill mix, because when you start getting above the 10, 15, 20% skill mix, you're probably frankly doing okay. Maybe not spectacularly, but you're doing okay. The if I've got primarily custodial buildings, and often those are in rural areas, I might say, do you really want to be skilled nursing, or is there a way to repurpose your building, serve the same population, and approach licensing and care delivery differently?
Okay, so good. So how might I approach that differently?
So, since we're in a hypothetical, and let's accept the fact that there are regulatory constraints and attorneys and all of these other people that are going to have to get involved in the, put all that to the side just for a second. If I were somebody new coming into the industry, I think I would build an independent living building, or I would buy all of these skilled nursing buildings that are going belly up for pennies on the dollar. I'd have them be independent living buildings. I would charge rent, and then I would put a menu together of care services that people could select on a needs basis, and those would be contracted out to third-party providers.
I
I would
really
literally
like that. Go ahead.
I would literally have the entire continuum in my building. The pieces that have to be regulated would be regulated, but it wouldn't be my problem.
So one more thing that as I'm listening to your thoughts on this, one of the things that I'm really intrigued on by is pace, and where you see pace fitting into all of this.
I think PACE has the potential to be an enormous player in the future. And here's why. Is all we've heard in our generation, and I think I'm going to guess that you and I are similar, plus or minus one dog year. We're probably the same age in dog years. And as all we've heard from the time we were in probably junior high on is what an enormous impact the boomers were going to have. And that included as we moved into college on the retirement systems in the country. And we know that 80 or 85% of the wealth nationally is controlled by boomers. That's a great factoid. The problem is that's controlled by 15% or less of the boomers. And so 85% of the boomers statistically have something like $250,000 or less in net assets. And when they retire, let's say they retire at 70 and they've got $250,000 and they've been burning cash at $50,000 or $60,000 a year, it's going to take somewhere between 5 and 7 years to burn through that money, assuming things like property taxes, if they own their home, stay the same, which they don't. In the community that I live in, because of the influx of 50% of the real estate transactions in my community in Washington State, 51%, I believe, last year were Californians coming in and buying a house for cash. I don't have a political view for that one way or the other, but from a practical perspective, as somebody that's nearing retirement, my property taxes last year quadrupled. They didn't go up by 3 or 4 or 5%. They went up by a factor of 4. If I were on a fixed income, I'm out of my house because my property tax payment's larger than my mortgage payment.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead.
I'm just going to say the point in all of that is you asked me about pace. I don't think healthcare is the driving issue as boomers really get 5 or 10 years into retirement. I think housing's the issue. And I think HUD understands this because one of the things you can get is, or at least used to be able to get, is some special financing through HUD. If you build a senior living community, it can be independent living, and you have an anchor tenant like a PACE program, you can get some specialized financing to do that. That's because somebody knows what the future holds.
Yeah,
and it's not boomers with a lot of money.
Yeah, so here's one of the things that I sort of puzzle over is that we have this this belief, I'll call it, that I should be able to live where I want to live and age in place where I want to age. And I'm not sure that that's a practical thing. I mean, nobody, if I decided that tomorrow I wanted to move to live in Beverly Hills, the government doesn't have an obligation to figure out how to make me go to a place where my housing costs would go up by 5x or something, right? And the government pick up that cost. Now, it's a little different when I'm already in a place, but I find myself thinking, so I live in a house. I've still got a modestly good mortgage on it, but I've got pretty good equity in it. And both my wife and I she's already maxed out her Social Security. She's a little older than me. I probably shouldn't say that on a live broadcast. Jada, don't tell on me. And I'm not that far away from being able to hit max Social Security as well. But when we hit max Social Security, between the two of us, we'll generate a little over $6,000 a month. And that's without looking at any savings or any housing equity or anything. And frankly, I've got enough equity in my house that I could probably move to even Texas, which is not the lowest cost housing. I could buy a house free and clear and $6,000 a month would, not give me an extravagant lifestyle, but I certainly could live comfortably on it. And so, but it would require me to live. I couldn't do that here in Sacramento where I live. So are we just going to end up seeing these mass migrations, or what do you think?
Well, I think that you are unusual for a couple of reasons. You've got historically high income, dual income household, and that's unusual. So you're going to max 2 people out on Social Security, and that's awesome. But I think that if you go back to the average having $250,000 in total assets, that probably means they weren't too large or high income two-income, high-income household. So let's say they've got a combined $4,000 a month, plus their $250,000. So that $250,000, and let's say that it's going to cost them $6,000 a month to live, for picking a number. Well, over 5 years, that's $125,000 for, no, that's $350,000. And
Yep.
they started with $250,000. So in 7 years, they burned through their cash. Now they're down to $4,000 a month plus inflation, and they're upside down. So I'm on something called the Commission on Aging, which is in Clark County, which is the county I live in. And they have this spectacular, and I mean a spectacular plan on how to approach aging moving forward for the county. The good news is it's spectacular. The bad news is it's so vast that even picking off two or three or four things at a time, you really don't get there wherever there is. Gertrude Stein, there's no there. But the one thing that I think is a flaw in the plan is it drives the concept of staying at home. And where I live, Clark County is very rural. I've got Portland and I've got Vancouver, which are reasonably major metropolitan areas, but everything else with it, you get 3 miles out of either one of those cities, you're in farm country. And if the government is going to be the funder of not only healthcare, but food and other services, transportation, they're going to have to find a way to get people into the core areas. So I think is what you're going to start seeing 10 years out is what we saw in the 60s for mid to high rise housing developments in urban cities for families, only they're going to be for seniors, to push the population back into population centers. It's the only way it's going to work out mathematically.
So this is really fascinating to me because I think that it's something that we sort of, the American dream is living in your single family home on a half acre, and going there until you exit feet first, after you breathe your last breath. But we also know that in reality, as we get older and we maybe one or two people living in a household, or even you have a single person because a spouse has passed or because of a divorce, the living alone is actually not that healthy for you. And it has not only emotional consequences, but it also has physical consequences that while older people might end up going kicking and screaming into high rises where there are smaller units and more concentration of care, it might actually make them happier. What do you think?
I have two thoughts on that. First of all, I can use my mom. My mom's 90 next Wednesday, and
Happy birthday to her.
Thank you. About 15 years ago, I would have already been in the industry for a quarter of a century, and I'd been preaching the gospel, if you will. Mom, you really need to think about this. You really need to think about this. And she finally moved in, sold her house that she'd been caring for because my dad had died a decade earlier, been caring for herself. She moved into a 55 plus community, and she was there about a month after living multiple years in a very isolated fashion in her home. And she literally said, I should have done this a decade ago. And
Yeah.
she, to this day, even though she's in a 55 plus community, so it's not regulated, but it's focused on seniors, really well done senior living communities that are 55 plus, they might as well be a CCRC because the residents figure out how to put programming together on their own and have an incredibly vibrant community. So she's an example, and I will use myself as an example because when I was doing turnarounds, I would physically move in and rotate through the different buildings to understand personally what the experience was living there in each of these communities. And so I didn't live in all of them. For the better part of 5 years, I lived in a senior living community 50% of my life. And I've got to tell you, if I had that as a multi-generational thing now that I don't have kids living at home, I'd be there tomorrow because it is an amazing lifestyle. but we've got so much stigma, that's negative stigma around old people, that even my mom at 90 needs to move to assisted living somewhere in the next 12 to 18 months. It's just a reality of the situation. At 90, she doesn't want to be with the old sick people.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's such an interesting thing. One of the things that continues to sort of perk through my head, and I know we're coming up on time here, but a few years ago, I got invited to spend a day knocking around some low-income senior living communities with the SHAG organization in Seattle. And we visited some older buildings and some newer buildings, and these are all, super low income, highly subsidized buildings. And so they're I don't want to say they were Spartan, but they were very basic. And the thing that really struck me about it was that the first thing was that every time we walked into a community and they look at me, because I'm now at that age where I age qualified, they'd look at me and they think, oh, fresh meat. And they were just so excited that I must be getting ready to move in, which was a little weird for me. But what I loved about it, and I think this was almost better in a sort of a lower economic, that they had to make their own lives because they didn't really have activity directors. And, again, this is non-licensed building, but they were having so much fun, and they had relationships and friendships and clubs and games and those kinds of things and this brings me back to one of my pet opportunities I see is we've got to do a better job at telling stories.
Yep, absolutely. We've got to take the stigma of aging out of our culture. I mean, we have so much consternation over the term senior citizen or elderly, or all of these terms that get branded as politically incorrect. I don't even know that we need a label. My mom's 90, her friends are all in their 80s and 90s. When I mingle with them, I don't say, gee, you're a senior citizen. I talk to them like they're just me. They're just a neighbor, right? So I don't, part of this is, how do we get the media to tell the story with us in an educated way?
Yeah, I think that's part. I think that the media is a problem. I think social media is a problem. I think that one of the things, we were actually having a conversation about ageism at our team meeting this morning. And one of the things that Leanne and my team pointed out was that until sort of around I guess probably the early 60s, and demographers started creating age cohorts, so boomers and silent generation and X's and millennials, that we were all just people. And that while on one hand, we can sort of see the usefulness of sort of putting people in cohorts, perhaps what it's really done is created barriers that don't need to exist.
I would completely agree with that. You wrote an article recently, last week, on ageism, which was a terrific piece. But the interesting thing that at least I find, especially like you, becoming part of that pre-retirement or an in-retirement age band, is even with dealing with, I have more success dealing with going back to labeling, Gen X, Y, and Z than I do in dealing with boomers, because Gen X, Y, and Z business owners are hungry to learn. And they don't have they may start the conversation off with, you're an old man, and we joke about that, but it quickly, and I mean quickly, evolves into me staying up until 2 o'clock in the morning last night working with the Gen X on how to rewrite some documentation to her staff in a way that would translate for them, right? As opposed to going off the deep end and ranting and raving. They were thoughtful about it, and they used me as a coach and a sounding board and a reality check. And it didn't have anything to do with generations. It had to do with my having 40 years experience and they're having 10.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the things that makes me really proud of my team is the oldest person who participates in my team is Jack Cumming, who's mid 80s. And the youngest is behind the scenes right here with us, Jada, who's just a year out of college. And when we get on our team meetings, we have these wonderful conversations. I would say we're not just work colleagues, we're friends. We see tremendous value, and I think that's the way life could and should be. So
completely agree. And if you've got a team like that, you can have fun with the labels. You can have fun with it rather than it categorizing anybody. You know, if somebody that I'm working with calls me old man, I take that as a compliment and have fun with it. And I'll call them young whippersnapper, some goofy term like that.
that's
It's
right.
just part of having fun. There's no offense intended.
Okay, so how do people find you?
They can find me on my LinkedIn page, and it's oh, there it is. Thanks. Wow, she's awesome. And you can also call me at 619-916-1171. Call or text me at that. That's my cell number, 619-916-1171.
Ken, thank you very much for your passion for our industry. Thank you for agreeing to spend some time with us today. This has been terrific. I often forget to do this, but I want to say thanks to Jada, who's in the background making all of this happen. She makes all the schedules work and everything, and
Amazing, Jada.
makes my life so much easier. I appreciate that. And so with that, I wish you a great weekend, and we will be back with some great content. And if you're going to be at the Smash Conference next week in Las Vegas, hope we get a chance to connect and tell some stories.
Thanks.